Yeah, from the cabin of integrity here, as we surpass the furthest distance humans have ever traveled from planet Earth, we do so in honoring the extraordinary efforts and feats of our predecessors in human space exploration.
Kia ora, I'm Sharon Brett Kelly. Today on The Detail, Orion's record-breaking journey to the moon is being hailed as a huge step towards life for humans beyond Earth.
And all of us commented how excited we are to watch this nation and this planet become a two-planet species.
Experts are also hailing it as an example of the conflict-free international group effort that goes on in space. But how can we really be sure of lasting, peaceful collaboration, given what's going on this planet right now? Well, the optimists throw back to the last big lunar missions more than 50 years ago.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running. Liftoff. We have a liftoff.
Countries worldwide were doing nuclear shelter raid practice runs, and everyone was really worried for these existential issues. It looked like the Cold War was going to continue. It was very similar, perilous circumstances. The one fantastic thing is that space has always acted as almost this very unique of human cooperation.
That's space lawyer Gregory Radisik. More from him soon. Plus, how New Zealand became one of the first nations to sign up to something called the Artemis Accords. First, though, how this mission is going to help get us to Mars.
My name is Dr. Morgan Cable. I am a senior lecturer at Te Haringawaka Victoria University of Wellington, and I'm also a senior scientist at the Planetary Science Institute. And formerly, I worked at the NASA Jet Propulsion Laboratory for over 10 years, working on a variety of different planetary missions, exploring all sorts of different corners of our solar system.
How did you end up at Victoria University?
Well, this space science major just had started up at Vic and seemed really fascinating. And I thought, boy, well, I'm up for an adventure, and being able to teach the next generation and get involved in a nation that is now ranked third in the world for launches. It really has that vibe of what NASA must have been like kind of in the 1960s, pushing boundaries, tackling new challenges. It's such an exciting time to be here.
So let's talk about Artemis 2. How does that fit into the big scheme of things? The ultimate goal is getting to Mars.
Yes, so the ultimate goals are to get a permanent human presence on the moon and to be able to extend that human presence to having people on Mars and hopefully a sustained presence there as well one day. So it's pretty exciting that after 50 years of not being able to explore our cosmic backyard with humans, that now we're finally at that cusp of being able to land the first person of color and the first woman on the moon, which are just going to be incredible achievements. And, while the U.S. is shouldering a lot of this burden right now, I think just like with the Apollo missions, we're going to see this as an international effort that builds upon and leverages a lot of the expertise and the technology developments across multiple nations and across the whole world, really.
So for you, as an expert in this area, what do you learn from this mission?
This mission in particular, Artemis 2, is largely about kicking the tires, essentially, of the Orion spacecraft, making sure that they understand how it behaves. But it's also about new observations of the moon and extended observations of understanding how the human body behaves and is affected by what we call deep space. So the areas that are sort of outside of just our standard low Earth orbit where the International Space Station is. And so being able to understand the effects of radiation, even over this shorter 10-day trip, can really help us get a better understanding of what things we might need to look out for when we're keeping humans permanently in these kinds of environments, either on a lunar base or eventually on that much longer transit to Mars.
Is radiation a big worry in terms of the negative effects on astronauts' health?
It certainly can have some negative effects, but we do have ways of mitigating that. There are certain ways you can provide shielding from just average radiation, and any times that there are sort of coronal mass ejections or times when solar activity makes that radiation a little bit more hazardous. There can be ways to protect the crew, to have them go into, say, a certain part of the spacecraft or their shelter that is much more heavily shielded.
What other potential health impacts do you have to kind of look out for, I suppose, in the preparation for a permanent presence on the moon?
Well, certainly the change in gravity, and that's something, luckily, since we've had astronauts spend quite long stints on the International Space Station, we understand that fairly well. I think the other aspect is more just the social, being physically placed on the moon. You look up and you see Earth, right? And it's not engulfing your entire field of view as it might be from the space station, from orbit around Earth. Now it's much further away, and those thoughts of, oh gosh, if something were to go wrong, it's, a multi-day journey back. And similarly from Mars, the Earth is just a blue glint in the sky, right? It's essentially a star. Many, many months to return back if the launch sort of cycle lines up just right. We tend to have a launch window for Mars once every 2 years. So it's not quite as straightforward to be able to go back and forth easily. And so I think being able to make sure that we understand how communities are going to function when they are much more isolated than they would be if they were just orbiting around the Earth is going to be something to explore.
What's the timeline? Is it 2028 we're looking at a permanent presence on the moon?
I believe that is the current target. And of course, with the administration and funding changes, some of those dates may move around. But I am confident that they are going to be taking these steps in as deliberate but safe of a manner as possible. Coming from the NASA center where I work, where we tend to focus more on robotic spacecraft, we care very much about our robots, but it's a very different scenario when you have precious human cargo involved. And so while we will be pushing hard to be able to make progress, to get those boots back on the moon as soon as we can, we want to do it as safely as we can.
2 years isn't very long. It's quite incredible that within that time, we're going to figure out how to live on the moon.
Yeah, well, we have been perfecting and developing a lot of the technology to do this for quite some time. The being able to preserve and have adequate nutrition, the water purification, filtration, to be able to recycle as much as we can so we can minimize the things that we do need to launch up and land on the moon to support that community. Certainly the sort of complexities of being able to get something out of Earth orbit into lunar orbit and then landing. Of course, we did it in the 60s with the Apollo missions, but now we're in some ways having to reinvent some of those things.
One of those things is the method of landing on the moon. I asked Morgan why.
Well, I think part of it just comes down to some of the complexities of the SLS.
Just remind me, SLS, what does that stand for?
It's a Space Launch System, SLS, the launch system that has been under development, wanting to be able to increase the thrust and essentially the power of what we can get up there. If you sort of compare SLS to the Apollo launch system, there are some differences between how much they can lift into orbit, like what their power is, and then conversely what they can potentially land on the moon.
Once we've sort of nailed that, permanent presence on the moon, Mars is next?
That is the plan. I mean, as Neil deGrasse Tyson, the famous astrophysicist, likes to say, anytime a meteor comes really close to Earth, that's the universe's way of saying, hey, how's that space program coming along? Because, these extinction level meteoritic events do happen.
I don't want to be the laughing stock of the galaxy, to be the only species that went extinct from an asteroid, yet we also had a space program. That's just embarrassing.
I feel like we are at the cusp of space becoming more accessible, and I just can't wait to see what's going to happen when we have these, international groups of people being able to sustain a community on the moon and ultimately on a place like Mars. I can see that in our lifetime now, and that's just such an incredible thing.
Remember the handshake in space between the Russian and American astronauts in 1975?
On July 17, 1975, 1 billion viewers witnessed an historic event live on television. Some 225 kilometers from the Earth, a Soviet and an American shook hands. And yet we were in the middle of the Cold War.
Gregory Radisik is a Canadian space lawyer at Bond University in Brisbane. He says that's just how friendly we all are in space.
The one fantastic thing is that space has always acted as almost this very unique of human cooperation. And listen, the moon, living on the moon long term will be largely associated with questions of survival. And when those existential rules come in place, I think what happens is people tend to put aside grievances on Earth and focus on working together to try to help each other survive and succeed.
You've written yourself that Artemis highlights how much remains unresolved from a legal and governance perspective. What do you mean by that?
Yes, so our legal and governance systems are lagging behind on the technological side. There's a real risk that the early actors, the countries or the companies that operate in space, those first ones that land on the moon will really shape the rules simply because they're first, which can obviously lead to a lot of conflict, unfair access to resources that are on the moon, environmental damage, damage to historical sites, damage to scientific experiments, or think of all the items on the moon that might garner some scientific knowledge. So there's a lot of unanswered questions on the international law side that they're currently being worked on, but the car is already on the way there. The road trips started to the moon, and we don't necessarily have a framework for when we get there.
What's there already? What sort of activity is happening on the moon already?
There's been scientific study. So we've had some private companies land rovers or crash rovers, but shown that, it's possible for a private company to get to the moon. We've obviously had the Americans land on the moon in the 1960s and 70s, but more recently we've had nations like India or China who've also reached the moon with scientific equipment. And on the legal side, we have a body at the United Nations that's existed since the 60s called UN COPIUS, the Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space. And they're really working on a multilateral solution to questions like space resource utilization. So that's what mining would look like. Article 2, for example, of the Outer Space Treaty states that no one's allowed to own a piece of any celestial body, a moon, an asteroid, Mars, for example. But we have some questions about if you're using a resource, is that owning it? If I'm mining all the gold off the moon and bringing it back, does that mean I own it, or should that be shared? If I set up a base, I obviously don't want people landing and taking off right next to me. That's dangerous. Is creating a safety zone or a fence around my base, is that a problem? Is that like sovereignty? So there's all these questions that on Earth, they would be practical, and you'd go, okay, well, that makes sense. Obviously, we need to do these things, but on the moon, it proposes kind of broader problems and secondary and tertiary issues.
So, okay, you can't own property, you can't own a piece of the moon, but you can take stuff away. I mean, can you mine it? We've got moon rock here, haven't we?
Yes. So there's been a lot of debate on this issue. So some people will say the Outer Space Treaty has this non-appropriation principle where it says you can't have sovereignty on the moon. It also has other articles, so that the whole treaty starts off with the exploration and use of space should benefit all mankind or all humankind. And people say, well, does that mean that any profits derived from mining in space have to be shared with the whole world? That same treaty talks about that the space should be purely for the peaceful uses, right? Peaceful purposes. And it prohibits military installations and weapon testing. But as you might No, most astronauts are fighter pilots and are members of the military in some way, shape, or form. So is that a military operation? We have treaty principles in place, but when it comes to actually trying them out and using them practically, we haven't done that really.
And do you think that you'll get there?
I don't know about that. So the interesting thing about the moon, people are very excited about the lunar base, but I really do feel for the first manned missions that go to the lunar surface, because ultimately you'll be living in a bit of a glorified shipping container for a few months at a time. You step outside, you immediately will die. It's a bit perilous. So I don't know about that, but you never know. Maybe we'll do another interview in 50 years and we'll see.
Well, yeah, I'll be 110 by then.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's like how many people survive on a submarine together for months at a time and they don't surface. So there are specially trained individuals who thrive in environments like that. I don't know if they want an annoying lawyer to yap about law and regulation. Maybe I should just stay on Earth and let the professionals do their work.
So let's be clear. When we talk about a permanent presence on the moon by 2028, there won't be hordes of people rushing up there to spend the rest of their lives, not immediately. But as the New Zealand Space Agency's deputy head, Andrew Johnson, says, the pressure is on to get some rules in place around how everyone behaves in space. He says Aotearoa has been deeply involved in that, as well as its own projects in space.
People always focus on astronauts, but I guess the thing that we like to draw people's attention back to is New Zealand's impact on space overall. We're one of less than 15 countries that have had host to launch capability. The capstone mission from Rocket Lab, which launched from Mahia in 2022, was actually the Pathfinder mission for this whole Artemis enterprise. So that was a satellite launched to the moon in 2022. And, we've got New Zealand experiments that have visited the International Space Station. We've got New Zealand technology and many, many satellites on orbit. And we've got many, many New Zealanders working in the space sector here on Earth, which we think is a great thing to celebrate.
How did New Zealand become one of the first signatories to the Artemis Accords?
The international architecture for managing, norms of behaviour in space centres on the UN's Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space. But really, this is a forum that dates right back to the kind of Cold War era, which is a very, very different context. And the major treaties under that architecture were kind of all agreed in the 1960s and didn't really have a concept of what the activities we were going to be involved in today would look like. So while we continue to build on that multilateral framework, New Zealand's also been an active participant in the Artemis Accords, which is an attempt to start building the ground for rules of behaviour for space exploration activity that we hope will eventually dock back in with the multilateral process, but we need something now because the space exploration activities are happening now.
And so what do we need?
Well, basically, we need to start building the expectations around how different countries will interact with each other as they conduct space exploration activities for the maintenance of a peaceful environment in outer space, including on the surface of the moon. So that's all about being transparent and clear with what those activities are, avoiding harmful interference, and really basically just having respect for each nation's activities.
I mean, given what's going on here on Earth, how do you do that?
Well, I think space has shown that even when things have been very tense on Earth, the potential for space collaboration continues. So the best example, of course, is the International Space Station, which hosts both American and Russian astronauts, as well as many others from other nations as well. So that's a great example of what can happen in space, even when there are tense situations on Earth. And the hope is that by investing time and resource into activities like the Artemis Accords, and also, I should say, the Artemis program, which is, of course, the missions that are returning people back to the moon, that is a further example of how we can have peaceful international collaboration.
But I just wonder, as activities increase on the moon and then later on Mars, and if there is going to be a permanent presence and other countries besides the US are involved in setting up bases on the moon. I mean, I'm thinking about China. Do you feel confident that these rules will be strong enough in terms of keeping the peace and in terms of making sure that the moon is protected?
Well, almost all nations, including the US, Russia, China, and of course New Zealand, are signatories to something called the Outer Space Treaty, which was one of these treaties I mentioned, established in the 1960s. But nonetheless, the principles of that treaty is all about peaceful cooperation, collaboration. And we shouldn't lose sight of the huge opportunity that the Artemis program in particular represents. The pivot that the Americans announced a couple of weeks ago in that program has opened up huge opportunities for scientific and technological collaboration. NASA has said that they won't have enough payloads on the US side to fill those rockets if they manage to get up to the frequency of launches that they're talking about by 2028. So they're looking around the world and saying, who wants to come with us on this journey and who wants to put scientific and technological payloads on these rockets? And that represents a huge opportunity for humanity, not least of which for the New Zealand sector as well.
Will New Zealand be putting up its hand for that?
Yeah, absolutely. We'll be going out to our sector very shortly to see what kind of ideas we have around the various researchers and companies and others who are involved in space exploration activities. New Zealand, as I say, we've already had lots of examples of New Zealand technology and experiments on orbit, a little bit closer to Earth primarily, and rather than around the moon. But nonetheless, there's huge potential, I think, and pockets of expertise around the New Zealand sector.
Such as?
Things like cislunar space situational awareness. So this is having an awareness of the space between the Earth and the Moon. There's expertise in our universities there. There's high temperature superconducting magnet expertise in both companies and universities in New Zealand, which has the potential to be used for thruster applications in deep space exploration. There are researchers looking at how you could use the regolith, so the soil on the Moon or on Mars, to build structures. So there are lots of little pockets of expertise all around New Zealand.
And when we talk about a permanent presence, in 2028, are we still just talking about a few people?
I think initially it will begin as quite small scale, and that's right as people get used to managing the environment and the particular risks that are associated with operating in an environment like that. But the ambition is to use the Moon ultimately as a staging point to conduct exploration deeper into the solar system, onto Mars potentially. And the idea of using ice, the lunar poles, as a potential source of fresh water, but also rocket propellant, means that you will need to have a substantial presence, I think, on the Moon to enable that activity to happen. It will start small, but I think over time, and depending on it's all proceeding smoothly and steadily, then you'll see that presence build up.
Are you talking about, small towns or smaller than that?
I'm not sure about towns.
I'm just trying to get an idea of what a permanent presence means.
Yeah, I think this will be a presence that is associated with primarily scientific and technological activity at first, before moving on to small-scale industrial activity, like I say, if there is an effort to mine the ice on the Moon for a source of fresh water and propellant. A lot of that may be done robotically, so I wouldn't imagine the numbers will be huge. But,
right.
But as it builds up, I think, if you talk to people like Elon Musk, his stated ambition is to create a permanent human presence on Mars. So he would expect that something would have to happen probably on somewhere much closer, like the Moon, first, before that could ever happen.
I mean, what kind of time frame are we talking about for Mars?
I think a presence on Mars, realistically, is probably a good 10, 15 years after that. But there will no doubt be ambitious goals set by different companies in different countries to just try and push it as far as we can to make as much progress as possible. The pace of expansion of activity in space, if you look at the number of satellites around the Earth, has just increased almost exponentially in the last 4 or 5 years as Starlink and other satellite systems get up to speed and start to deploy their constellations. So, activity further into space on the Moon and then beyond, if it follows anything like the pattern we've seen in low Earth orbit, that's definitely possible.
That's it for today. The Detail is a newsroom production supported by RNZ and New Zealand On Air. Today's podcast was produced by Gwen McClure and engineered by William Saunders. Thanks to Morgan Cable, Gregory Rudisick and Andrew Johnson. I'm Sharon Brett-Kelly. Mā te wā.